Inside a bustling courtroom, the air was thick with tension. As the white judge sat at the front, his eyes scanning the room with practiced indifference, the door creaked open, and a lone figure walked in. Head held high, the black woman in question took her seat in the defendant's chair with a calm that seemed out of place in such a charged atmosphere. She wore no visible signs of distress or fear. Instead, there was an air of quiet confidence about her that seemed to almost unsettle the judge, who had seen his fair share of defendants come and go. But none like her. The room fell silent as all eyes turned toward her. But she never once flinched. She had seen this before. This was her world. The judge cleared his throat and began his usual routine without acknowledging her presence in any special way, his gavel striking the desk with a sharp echo as he outlined the charges against her. A minor offense in his eyes, but one that would bring about a penalty according to the law. The woman listened intently to every word, but her face remained unreadable, her gaze unwavering from the judge. At first glance, she looked like just another person caught in the web of the legal system, a simple defendant caught in the grind of a system that seemed indifferent to individual stories. But this woman was far from ordinary. She was not here by accident, not here because of some mistake or poor judgment. She was here because she understood exactly how the system worked, because she had spent years studying it from the inside out. As a courtroom analyst, her job was to observe, to listen, to understand the inner workings of the court, and to provide invaluable insight into the way trials unfolded. She was not just a bystander in this world. She was part of it, a silent observer who knew the system better than most of those who worked within it. And yet here she was now sitting before the very judge, who had no idea who he was dealing with. The judge continued speaking, not once pausing to consider the possibility that the woman sitting before him might be someone more than just a defendant. His focus was on the case, the fine he was about to impose, the legal process that demanded his attention. The woman felt a flicker of irritation rise within her, but she suppressed it quickly. She had learned long ago that patience was often more powerful than confrontation. She had come to understand the dynamics of power in these rooms and how to navigate them. She had learned when to speak and when to remain silent, how to remain composed in the face of authority, how to use her knowledge of the law to remain invisible yet effective. She had watched many judges over the years. She had studied their quirks, their tendencies, their biases, and how they shaped the outcomes of cases. She had watched the courtroom drama unfold countless times, but never before had she felt the sharp sting of a judgment pass without a second thought. She knew how easily the system could dehumanize those it was meant to serve, but today would be different. She could feel it in the air. The judge's voice was growing louder, more insistent, but the woman remained unmoved. Every word seemed to bounce off her like water off a duck's back. Her mind was already elsewhere, processing, already analyzing every detail of the case. The room, the dynamics unfolding before her. She knew that this was more than just a trial. This was a test, a challenge, a moment where the balance of power might shift without anyone even realizing it. Yet, as the judge continued his monologue, she couldn't help but feel a sense of unease building in her chest. The fine was already decided in his mind, but she knew something he didn't, something that would change everything. And as the proceedings continued, she braced herself for the moment when her true role in this courtroom would be revealed. The judge continued his speech, the words flowing mechanically from his lips as he outlined the fine that would be imposed upon her, a fine he deemed fair without even considering the circumstances or her background. The woman's eyes remained fixed on him, her expression unreadable. But in her mind, she was already several steps ahead. She knew how this would play out. She had seen it all before. The legal system moved in predictable ways. It was a machine that churned out decisions based on rules and procedures, but rarely on empathy or understanding. It wasn't that the judge was inherently cruel or malicious. He was simply doing his job according to the rules that had been set in place for him. But she knew those rules were often flawed and in need of scrutiny. The judge finally paused after delivering the penalty, his gaze turning toward her for the first time since the proceedings began. He looked at her expectantly, waiting for her reaction. The room held its breath. She remained silent for a moment, her eyes still locked onto his. She knew what she could do next. She could speak up, challenge him, correct the error in his judgment. But something told her it wasn't the right time, not yet. Instead, She let the silence stretch on for a few more seconds, allowing the weight of the moment to settle over the room before speaking in a voice that was calm yet firm. She asked him a question about the specifics of the case. Her words were measured but packed with an undeniable authority that caused the judge to pause for a fraction of a second. It was subtle but enough to make him hesitate for just a moment longer than usual in a courtroom, where hesitation was a rare thing. The woman's question was seemingly innocent, an inquiry into the finer details of the case. But to those who knew the law, it was clear she was testing him. She was probing his knowledge, pushing him to reveal whether he had truly understood the complexities of the situation, or if he had simply followed the script in front of him. Without question, the judge blinked, and then responded quickly, almost defensively. His answer was textbook dry, and devoid of any real depth, but the woman could tell he hadn't thought about the case in its entirety. She could see the gaps in his understanding. She could see the way his confidence masked a lack of true comprehension. It was a typical reaction for someone in his position, someone who relied on routine and precedent rather than personal judgment. But to her it was an opening, an invitation to demonstrate just how much more she knew about the case than he did. The judge noticed the way her eyes sharpened as she spoke. She was not intimidated by him. Not at all. There was no hint of fear in her demeanor, only the quiet assurance of someone who had been in this position countless times before. He shifted in his seat, a little uncomfortable, but he tried not to show it. He had ruled in hundreds of cases like this one, but something about her presence unsettled him. As she continued to speak with a quiet precision, offering her own insights into the case, he began to feel the weight of his earlier decision pressing on him. It was clear she knew more than he had assumed. It was clear she wasn't just any defendant caught up in the machine of the courtroom. She was someone who understood the intricacies of the law at a level that far exceeded his own. And it was in that moment that he realized something he had overlooked, something he had missed. When she first entered the room, she wasn't just sitting there like any other defendant. She was there as someone who had an understanding of the system from the inside out, a system he thought he controlled, but one she could navigate with ease. The tension in the room shifted ever so slightly as the judge processed this realization, but it was enough to make him feel uneasy, a sense of doubt creeping in for the first time since the trial began. The judge's eyes darted from the woman to his notes, then back to her, as he tried to maintain control over the situation. But his confidence began to waver. There was a subtle shift in the way the room felt, the air now heavy with an unspoken understanding. The woman had asked another question, this time more pointed than before, her voice calm, but carrying an undeniable weight, as if she were offering him a challenge rather than a simple inquiry. She spoke with such quiet authority that it was almost as if she were the one presiding over the trial. The way she framed her questions made it clear she was well versed in the intricacies of courtroom procedure and legal nuances far beyond the surface-level understanding the judge had assumed she possessed. Her words struck a nerve with him, and he could feel his grasp on the proceedings slipping. For the first time, he realized he wasn't just dealing with a defendant. She was someone who had spent years analyzing cases, studying the patterns of legal decisions and outcomes. She wasn't here by chance. She wasn't simply caught in the system. She was a part of it, and in many ways she understood it better than he did. It was unsettling, a realization that sent ripples of doubt through his mind, but he refused to let it show. He cleared his throat and tried to regain control of the situation as his gavel fell against the desk with a loud echo. The sharpness of the sound seemed to momentarily snap him back into his role. The judge recited the terms of the fine once more, but now there was a slight falter in his voice, as if he weren't entirely sure of the fairness of his decision. The woman's gaze remained fixed on him, unwavering. As she studied his reaction, she could see the cracks forming in his composure, and it gave her a sense of quiet satisfaction. But she didn't let it show. She had long since learned the power of patience in a courtroom, the power of letting things unfold at their own pace, watching the game play out before making her move. She knew the judge wasn't accustomed to being questioned like this, not in such a direct manner. He had become used to the ritual of the courtroom, the routines that followed each case, the predictable patterns that left little room for deviation. But now here she was, a woman who refused to simply accept the decisions of the court without scrutiny. Her presence was a disruption in a space designed for order and predictability, but the woman wasn't interested in playing by the rules of complacency. She wasn't there to be another cog in the machine. She was there to make the judge question his own assumptions, to make him reconsider the way he approached his job, the way he viewed the people who came before him. She wasn't here to challenge him in the traditional sense, to fight against the system in a dramatic display of rebellion. She was here to quietly dismantle his confidence, to expose the limits of his understanding without ever raising her voice or making a scene. She knew this game well. She had spent years studying it, watching others try to fight against the system only to burn themselves out in the process. It wasn't about brute force or loud protests. It was about subtlety, quiet intelligence, and the ability to navigate the system in a way that made it bend without ever breaking. The judge continued his spiel, but it was clear to her that he was no longer fully in control of his thoughts. His words seemed to lose their conviction as he recited them, the certainty in his voice faltering with each passing moment. It wasn't just that she had caught him off guard. It was that he was beginning to doubt himself, to question his own judgment. As he looked at her, he couldn't help but wonder who she really was, what else she might know about the case, and how many others like her were sitting in this very courtroom right now, playing their parts, unnoticed, perhaps even invisible in the eyes of the very people who held power over them. The woman sat still, her mind working behind the mask of calm she wore. She was learning everything she needed to know about the judge and his approach, and she knew that the moment was coming when the balance of power would shift, and it would happen without a word spoken. The woman's presence in the courtroom continued to weigh heavily on the judge as he attempted to regain his composure, his mind racing as he tried to follow the scripted procedures that had guided him through countless cases before. But this time, something was different. The woman was not just another defendant. She was a force in the room, something he could not easily dismiss. Her silence was now a subtle pressure bearing down on him, pushing him to confront the doubts swirling within his mind. He glanced at her once more, her expression unchanged, as if she could see right through him, and he couldn't help but wonder how much she knew, how much she had observed in all her years of analyzing courtrooms. Like his, had she seen judges like him crumble under the weight of their own ignorance? He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, but the woman remained still as ever, not giving him the satisfaction of knowing that her calm was a calculated performance. She wasn't here to intimidate him or to make a scene. She was simply here to observe, to let the system reveal itself for what it truly was. And it was slowly happening before his very eyes. He had made an assumption about her the moment she walked into the room, that she was just another defendant, another face among many, another person to be processed by the system. But now he could see his mistake. He had underestimated her. He had assumed that she would comply with the routine of the courtroom, that she would simply accept his authority without question. But now it was clear that she was not one to be dismissed so easily. She knew the game. She knew how it worked. She had seen it all before. And now she was watching him closely. She wasn't just waiting for her sentence. She was waiting for him to reveal something about himself, something about the way he ran his courtroom, something about the decisions he made when he thought no one was paying attention. The judge tried to focus on the case at hand, to redirect his attention back to the fine he had imposed, but his mind kept returning to the woman's quiet confidence, to the way she had questioned him earlier, to the subtle challenge in her eyes. It wasn't just a question about the case anymore. It was a challenge to his very authority, a reminder that the legal system wasn't as infallible as he had always believed, that there were cracks in the foundation of the court that could be exposed with just the right touch. The tension in the room began to grow palpable as the woman's silence stretched on. The other people in the courtroom could feel the subtle shift, the way the atmosphere had changed. It was no longer just a simple case. It was a moment of reckoning, a moment where the truth of the courtroom was about to be laid bare. The judge's voice began to falter as he continued speaking, his words losing their sharpness. He was no longer sure of himself. He was no longer certain of his own authority. He began to wonder if the woman had come here to make him question everything he thought he knew about the court, about his role within it. Was she trying to expose something about the way he ruled, the way he judged cases? Was she trying to make him realize that his understanding of justice was limited and incomplete? The judge felt the weight of her gaze pressing on him. It was as if she could see into the very core of his decision-making process, and he couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching him with an intensity that no one else in the room had ever done before. She had seen the cracks in his armor, and now she was waiting for him to acknowledge them, or to hide them deeper. He didn't know which choice he would make, but the pressure was mounting, and it was only a matter of time before he would have to make a decision whether to continue with his sentence, or to pause and reconsider the assumptions he had made about the woman sitting before him. He wasn't sure what she wanted from him, but he knew one thing for certain: she was not going to make this easy. The woman's steady gaze never wavered as the judge faltered before her. The tension in the courtroom grew thicker as the seconds ticked by, each one feeling like an eternity. The judge could feel his grip on the case slipping further as her presence in the room seemed to expand, filling every corner of the space. He had thought he understood the power dynamics of this courtroom, but now it felt as though the rules had changed without anyone acknowledging it. He had assumed that issuing a fine was all he needed to do to close the case, to move on, but with each passing moment, he could feel that simple judgment slipping further from his control. The woman was not just a passive participant in this drama. She was shaping it, she was influencing it, and he was starting to realize just how much he had underestimated her. It wasn't the questions she asked, or the way she presented herself that caught his attention. It was the way she carried herself, the quiet certainty in her posture, the way she spoke without raising her voice, but still made every word feel like a quiet command. He had seen many defendants over the years, some meek, some defiant, but none had ever made him question himself so completely. None had ever caused him to doubt the correctness of his own rulings. She wasn't challenging his authority directly, she wasn't being confrontational, but she was doing something far more subtle, far more powerful. She was making him aware of the cracks in his own understanding of the law, the cracks in the system he had dedicated his career to upholding. And now those cracks were starting to widen, and the pressure was mounting. He glanced down at his notes again, his hands feeling clammy as he tried to regain focus, but his mind kept returning to her calm, unflinching gaze, the way she had dissected his decision, without a single accusation, without raising her voice. He had assumed she was just another case, a routine charge, another name on a list, but she had proven him wrong. She wasn't just a defendant, she wasn't just a statistic in his courtroom. She was a part of the system that he didn't fully understand. And now he was beginning to feel that sting of realization settling in his chest. The woman sat in silence as the judge fumbled with his papers, his eyes darting between his notes and her face, as though searching for something, searching for a sign that he could continue on with his ruling without facing the full weight of his own ignorance. But the woman said nothing. Her silence felt heavy now, a challenge that he couldn't ignore. She was giving him space to think, but she wasn't going to make it easy. She wasn't going to break character to give him the comfort of knowing he was in control. She simply waited, her eyes sharp and steady, waiting for him to make his next move. And the judge was at a loss for how to proceed. He had been in this position hundreds of times before, but never had he felt so unsure, never had he felt so exposed, so vulnerable. In front of the entire courtroom, this woman had a power over him, a quiet strength that he hadn't anticipated. It wasn't a power born of anger or force, it was born of knowledge and control. And as he looked at her, he realized just how much he had taken the system for granted, how much he had relied on his authority without ever questioning whether it was truly deserved. She wasn't asking for anything from him, she wasn't demanding a different outcome. She wasn't pleading for sympathy, she was simply showing him the limitations of his own understanding. And as the silence stretched on, the judge couldn't help but feel a shift inside himself, something that had been stirred by her presence, something that had made him rethink his own role in this courtroom. He had never been faced with a moment like this before, a moment where he had to question not just the outcome of a case, but the very way he had approached his job. And it unsettled him deeply. He didn't know how to respond or what to do next, but he knew one thing for certain: he would never look at the courtroom the same way again. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his fingers drumming nervously against the desk as he struggled to process the realization that had been creeping up on him. Since the moment the woman entered the courtroom, he had always prided himself on his ability to remain in control of the room, to dictate the pace of the trial, to issue judgments swiftly and decisively. But now he was unsure. The weight of his earlier decision felt heavier than before, And the more he thought about it, the more he questioned whether it had been the right one. He glanced at the woman once again, her eyes locked onto his, and for the first time he saw something there, not just confidence, but something deeper, something that suggested she knew more than she was letting on, something that made him wonder just how much he had seen in this courtroom, how many judges like him had walked into their chambers with their heads full of certainty and left with their confidence shaken, how many had come to the same conclusion he was now reaching, that the system they so staunchly upheld was far from perfect. The woman had already proven that she understood the law better than most of the people in the room. She had already demonstrated her keen sense of the courtroom dynamics, her ability to navigate the space with ease, while others stumbled through the routine. But what struck the judge most was how effortlessly she had exposed his own insecurities, his own lack of understanding about the very system he had worked within for so long. It wasn't just that she had corrected him on legal details or pointed out flaws in his reasoning. It was the way she had made him feel small without ever saying a word, without ever raising her voice. She had taken his authority and unraveled it piece by piece, and now he was left holding the threads, unsure of how to tie them back together. He could feel the room growing restless as the silence stretched on the other people in the courtroom, shifting in their seats, sensing that something was wrong, but unaware of the quiet battle playing out before them. The defense attorney caught the judge's eye and gave him a subtle nod, as if to suggest that it was time to move on. But the judge couldn't. He wasn't ready to move on, not yet, not with the weight of his own doubts pressing down on him. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he knew that he couldn't just continue as if nothing had happened. The woman sat motionless, her expression still unreadable, as she waited for the judge to make his move. She wasn't in a hurry. She wasn't concerned with the passage of time. She was simply observing the way this moment unfolded, waiting for the judge to either confront the truth of his position or bury it deeper within himself. But either way, she would be there to witness it. The judge could feel the pressure mounting, and for the first time in his career, he wondered whether he had truly earned the position he held. Had he deserved the gavel, the authority, the responsibility that came with it, or had he simply relied on the power granted to him by tradition and structure without ever questioning whether he was fit to wield it? The woman's quiet presence in the room had exposed a vulnerability he hadn't known existed in himself. It wasn't just about the case, it wasn't just about the fine, it was about something far larger. It was about the way the system worked, and whether it could truly be trusted to deliver justice, or whether it had simply become a machine that ground people up without ever stopping to consider their humanity. He had always believed in the system, in the way it was supposed to work, in the fairness it was supposed to represent, but now he wasn't so sure, he wasn't so certain that what he had been doing all these years was truly serving the people who came before him. He wasn't sure if the power he had taken for granted was as righteous as he had once believed. The woman hadn't asked for any of this. She hadn't demanded anything from him. She had simply shown up, and by her presence alone she had forced him to look at the cracks in the system and in himself. And now the question lingered in the air, whether the judge would be able to confront those cracks or continue pretending they didn't exist. The room was still and heavy as the judge tried to steady his breath. The woman's gaze never left him, but it wasn't judgment he felt in her eyes. It was something far more unsettling. It was an understanding, as though she could see right through the armor he had built around himself. The system he had dedicated his life to was crumbling before him, not from any outward attack, but from the slow realization that perhaps it wasn't as just as he had always believed. He had spent years wearing the mantle of authority with pride, but now the weight of it felt burdensome and foreign. It was as though the very foundation of everything he had stood for had begun to shift beneath his feet, and he wasn't sure how to steady himself. She was silent, still unmoving, but her presence was enough to push him further into the unknown. The judge's hand shook slightly as he reached for his gavel, his knuckles whitening from the tension, but he didn't bring it down. Instead, he sat there in the stillness of the moment, not knowing what to say, not knowing how to proceed. The silence stretched on, and he could feel the eyes of everyone in the courtroom on him. He was the one in charge, but for the first time in his career, he wasn't sure what that meant anymore. The woman was right there in front of him, not demanding, not yelling, not making any grand gestures. She was simply waiting. She was letting him come to his own conclusion, And it was that quiet challenge that was driving him to the brink of his own self-doubt. It was as though her very calmness was an indictment of everything he had done. He could feel the weight of his years of decisions pressing down on him, and for the first time he wondered if all of it had been for nothing. Had he been serving justice, or had he simply been perpetuating a system that needed to be questioned? Had he ever really seen the people who stood before him for who they truly were, or had he been blinded by his own authority? The woman's silence was a kind of power, a power that didn't need to be spoken, but was felt in the way she held space. She wasn't trying to break him, she wasn't seeking a confrontation, she was simply making him aware of the truth, and the judge was struggling to hold on to the certainty that had once guided him through every decision he made. He had been trained to follow the law, to uphold it without question, but now he was questioning it, questioning whether the law he had sworn to uphold was truly just, or if it had been warped over time to serve only a certain few. He had never thought much about the implications of his role. Until now he had always believed that he was above reproach, that the decisions he made were sound and final. But now he was realizing that his power came from a place of unquestioned privilege, and not from any innate sense of righteousness. He had never had to face the consequences of his own biases, his own blind spots, but the woman had made him face them whether he wanted to or not. And now he was confronted with the uncomfortable truth that his rulings were not always fair, they were not always based on true justice, and that knowledge weighed heavily on him. The woman continued to sit silently, her posture never changing, but the energy in the room had shifted. It was as if everyone in the courtroom had stopped breathing, waiting to see what the judge would do next. He could feel their eyes on him, but it was her eyes that held the most power over him. It was her unspoken challenge that was making him question everything he had ever known about the law and his place in it. He wanted to reach for the gavel to end the trial, but something inside him held him back. Something inside him urged him to pause, to think before making the final call. But he didn't know how to think anymore. He didn't know how to see the law in the same way he had seen it before. The room was thick with expectation, and for the first time in his life the judge wasn't sure what the right thing to do was. But he knew one thing for sure: he could never go back to the way things had been before. He could never look at the courtroom the same way again. He could never look at himself the same way again. The judge sat there frozen, caught in a moment of self-reflection. The courtroom around him seemed to fade into the background as all his attention focused on the woman sitting before him. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the weight of her gaze still holding him captive. She had done what no one had ever done before. She had forced him to see himself, to question the foundation of his entire career. And now there was no going back. The silence that had filled the room was oppressive. It seemed to stretch endlessly, but it was broken only by the soft shuffle of papers from the defense table, the murmurs of the court staff in the back. But even they knew that this was no ordinary moment. There was something in the air, something that none of them had seen before. Something had shifted within the judge, and it was obvious to everyone in the room. But no one dared speak of it aloud. The woman didn't need to say another word. She had already done what she came to do. She had opened the judge's eyes to the realities of the system he had sworn to uphold, and now it was up to him how he would proceed. Would he close his eyes to the truth and continue on with his ruling, or would he acknowledge the cracks that had been exposed and change his course? The judge wasn't sure what to do. He had never been in a position like this. He had never had to question his own role in a case or his own understanding of justice. He had always followed the law, believing it to be the guiding principle, the truth, the standard by which all things should be judged. But now the woman's presence had shattered that certainty and left him with nothing but doubt. He wanted to reach for the gavel, to end the proceedings, to regain control, but his hand hovered over it, unsure, his mind whirling with thoughts he couldn't quite process. He glanced at the defense attorney, whose expression was unreadable, but there was something in their eyes, something that seemed to acknowledge the unspoken shift in the room. They were waiting for the judge to make a decision. The woman still sat unmoving, not watching him with expectation, but simply observing and waiting for the judge to find his own answers. And that was the hardest part for him. The woman hadn't made demands. She hadn't pushed for a different outcome. She had only shown him the truth of his own actions. And now it was up to him whether he would accept that truth or continue in denial. He realized with a sinking feeling that the power he had always held was never truly his to command. It had always been given to him by a system that was deeply flawed by structures that prioritized efficiency over fairness and had left so many behind in the process. He had been part of that system for so long that he had come to believe it was the only way. But now he saw it as a machine that ran on assumptions, on blind trust, and not on justice. He had failed to see that the people in his courtroom weren't just cases to be processed. They were real people with stories, lives that were more complex than the narrow lens through which he had been taught to view them. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, and he felt a sense of shame wash over him. He had been so wrapped up in the routine of his role that he had never stopped to think about its deeper implications. Now he was forced to confront those implications. With no easy answers, no easy way out, he couldn't unsee what had been exposed. And he knew he couldn't simply pretend everything was fine. He had to make a choice. He could either move forward and continue with the fine, but that would mean denying the truth that had been revealed to him. Or he could pause, he could stop the trial, and take a step back to reassess everything. The woman had done something to him that no other defendant had done before. She had made him doubt the very system he had once trusted without question, and now the choice was his. He could either continue in ignorance, or he could take the first step toward change. The weight of the decision felt suffocating, but for the first time in his career, the judge felt the true responsibility of his position. He wasn't just a figurehead, he wasn't just a tool of the law, he was part of a system that had the power to shape lives. And now he realized that it was his duty to ensure that system was fair and just. He could no longer turn a blind eye to its flaws. He could no longer be a passive observer. He had to act. And as he lifted the gavel in his hand and turned toward the woman, his voice finally broke the silence. The decision had been made, and it was a decision that would change everything.